Can we start
Yeah.
with your name, when you were born, where, and some memories of your family in your childhood?
Mm-hmm. I was born in New York City, in Manhattan, 1955. I grew up in New York. My parents were immigrants. My father was born in Germany, my mother in England. My father was half Jewish and was evacuated on a so-called Kindertransport to England in 1938, along with many other kids of mixed parentage or entirely Jewish. Under German law, he was known as a half-Aryan. He emigrated with his parents, who came out the following year, and his siblings. He emigrated with one of his brothers and his parents in 1940 during the Battle of Britain to New York. My mother was evacuated with some of her classmates in 1941 or so, or 40, to Canada, where she finished school and then went on to the United States for a year or two before returning to Britain in 1944. So my father learned his English in England. My mother was English, so my accent is more North Atlantic than Manhattan. Both my parents are artists. My grandfather was a painter as well, so we grew up in a creative environment. I and my three siblings, but being the eldest, what I wanted was out at an early age, and at the age of 15 I traveled alone to the United Kingdom to visit relatives and just see a bit of the world. At the age of 18 I traveled to the European continent on my own for several months, staying in youth hostels and with friends and relatives, and for the first time I visited Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, saw the Iron Curtain, saw the reality that I'd read a lot about and was very, very curious about. I finally saw it with my own eyes. And the following year I studied in the United Kingdom, in London. I studied Czech language and literature. It's my third year of university, junior year abroad. I was otherwise an international relations major. I then went on to focus on international relations and Eastern Europe as a graduate student, first in Bologna and then at Johns Hopkins University in Washington. My first visit to the Balkans was while studying in Bologna. The group of students and the professor went to Belgrade to spend a week at the Yugoslav Institute of International Relations, where Professor Ivo Mates explained Yugoslavia's geopolitical situation, and I first had the most superficial of conversations about Kosovo. Now this was in 1977, and Kosovo really wasn't on anyone's map outside of the immediate region. In 1980, end of 1980, I moved to Europe to work as a reporter for Business International, which had a weekly Business Eastern Europe and monthly Doing Business in Eastern Europe. That office was based in Vienna, and I started making regular trips into Eastern Europe. I would also add that after I got my master's, I traveled around in the Soviet Union on my own for several weeks, alone, by train, got to meet people, test my Russian out.
What were your impression of Yugoslavia in 77?
Well, all I saw in 77 was what I could see from the train between the Italian border and Belgrade and back, and it seemed to be rather relatively undeveloped and traditional. Belgrade itself reminded me of some cities in Czechoslovakia, with the exception that you could buy a Western newspaper, at least on Terazia, from a newspaper stand in front of the Hotel Moskva. It was lively, interesting, freer than places in the Soviet bloc that I'd visited. There were certainly in sense of consumer goods, the kind of shops that were open. You didn't see things like that in Prague for another 5 or 10 years. So they were ahead of the game at that point. And yeah, reasonable prices, farmers markets that were well stocked, etc. I started working for Voice of America as a correspondent in 1984, and shortly thereafter began traveling to Yugoslavia. I was based in Vienna. My focus was basically all of Eastern Europe. And as an American, I needed a Yugoslav visa. I attended the trial of a Croatian war criminal from World War II, which was, I only attended, I think, 1 or 2 hearings, but still it was an experience. Shortly thereafter, I finally got my driver's license, and it was a lot freer to drive around Yugoslavia and the region. I came to Kosovo by car in April 1985, and was impressed by the landscape, by the exoticness of the place. It was less European than anywhere else I had been. I was still young and not that well traveled in the region. So there was a lot that I really didn't have explanations for, a lot of what I saw. And communications were difficult. Very, very few people spoke English in Prishtinë in those days. The wave of guest workers to Switzerland and Germany was just beginning, so yes, you saw Swiss license plates, particularly in Prizren and surroundings. I didn't speak any Albanian. I didn't really speak Serbian, but I could understand some based on my knowledge of Czech and Slovak and Russian. And I traveled around, interviewed people, fell in love with Prizren, came back to Prizren and Pea and Prishtinë several months later in the autumn, in September, I believe, because I was curious and it was still newsworthy. I had been challenged while reporting in Romania. I had spoken to an American diplomat who told me I was wasting my time going after the issues of the Hungarian minority, that, you know, go to Kosovo if you want to deal with something, don't try to stir up trouble here. And I wasn't trying to stir up trouble, I was only trying to understand the relationships, why Ceausescu was engaging in what we now know are clearly populist, self-serving activities to undermine the Hungarian community there. And something was going on here in a different form, but the end result was more or less the same. On every subsequent visit, there were more police, there were more armored personnel carriers parked in the park behind the Grand Hotel, where the Heroina statue sculpture is today. It was an interior ministry car park in those days, or it became one. It had just been a city park when I first came here. And by 1989, when I was here once or twice, one's freedom of movement was limited to the extent that one had to have a permit from the Secretariat of Information of the Autonomous Socialist Province of Kosovo and Metohija to travel around the province, with the municipalities specified where one could and could not go, written in hand. And I remember, and not just municipalities, but even towns, and I had a permit that said not allowed to go to Unic. And I went to Unic and was stopped by the police. I got the distinct impression that the police officer was not particularly gifted in reading Serbian, and said, oh, Unic, yeah, okay, fine, sure. This is the one place I wasn't supposed to be. Not that I stumbled on any Kačaks or their descendants, but what I found there, and which was gone by '99, was a very traditional way of life. No asphalt half the time, no electricity. Women in traditional clothes, families living in kulas, and there were more kulas in Unic than anywhere else in Kosovo. It was like a trip into the past that hadn't been spoiled by what we now call globalism, what then was called modernization or Americanization.
Have you done any
Or what?
reading? I mean, you were traveling. Did you read anything that prepared you to understand Kosovo? I mean, I know you are quite literate, so I
Yeah,
imagine.
there wasn't Black Lamb, Great Falcon, or whatever is called by Rebecca West. Yeah, I'd read the pertinent chapters by my second visit or during my second visit. But she had a very special, myopic view of the place based on who she was traveling around with and who she spoke to. I had read more about Albania, and frankly I was a lot more interested in going to Albania than Kosovo, but that was back in the 1980s for an American citizen simply not in the cards. So I was curious about Albanian culture as such, and I looked for it in Kosovo and in Macedonia. The only places where I really felt that I might be living in a traditional Albanian area were here in Dibra in Macedonia. In fact, almost more there. The influence was palpable in the town. It wasn't like the rest of Macedonia then. Now it's completely different. Most of the Albanians have emigrated to Staten Island and sent back a lot of money, and so the city has changed. But so yeah, I'd done a little reading, but there wasn't a whole lot available. It was more a question of discussing Kosovo with other journalists who had been here, who knew who was who knew what a dilemma it was for Belgrade and what Zagreb's and Ljubljana's views were. Particularly Victor Meyer of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, who had been covering the region since 1956, who died a couple of years ago, and the Reuters correspondent in Belgrade at the time, and a few others. So there were people who were telling me what was important, what was interesting, but no, compared to any other part of the region, there was really no literature that focused on Kosovo. Nevertheless, what I did was, since I could more or less read Serbian with a dictionary. I subscribed to Jedinstvo, which was a daily in those days. And look, there were 3 dailies. There were Jedinstvo, Rilindja and Tan, and given that I didn't speak or read Albanian or Turkish, I could sort of plow through Jedinstvo, and these copies would pile up on my desk from about 1987, 86 or 87 onwards at work. And it was at the time of the inflation, and so we'd pay a subscription for a year, and then after 6 months, they come back from Belgrade, the distributor, and say that they need the same amount again because they've exhausted the money, because they didn't keep it in hard currency. They immediately transferred it at the beginning of the subscription into dinars, but it didn't hold out for the year. So eventually I cancelled after several years. But in the meantime, I was able to follow developments in Jedinstvo, in Nin and Danas and elsewhere, and get a flavor of Vremya, when it started publishing, get a flavor of how the Serbian media was covering Kosovo and the growing hysteria here in the late 80s already. I then came here in 1989, twice in the spring, once around Easter. And that, I think, that was when I visited Unic for the first time. And then again for Vidovdan, where I witnessed the celebrations in Gračanica on the eve before Milosevic came, which could be summed up as a lot of very drunk Serbs in the street and gridlock. And the media were taken there by bus, but the only way back was on foot. I mean, I saw what I needed to see within about 20 minutes, and then I walked back to Prishtinë over the hills. And the next day we were taken to Gazimestan, and Milosevic was flown in by helicopter. We were kept under a tent. I've recorded him. I still have the tape recording of his notorious speech. But what I found interesting, having covered dictators throughout the region, notably Ceausescu, was the fear of the crowd that the state and party apparatus had. Just as with Ceausescu, Milosevic was kept well away from the crowd. And across the highway, and it wasn't much of a highway in those days, it was a 2-lane road, there was a temporary encampment of Yugoslav military vehicles that included tanks with cannon and armored personnel carriers and various other vehicles, which I photographed and still have the pictures, which give one an image of an attempt, I suspect. The state didn't really know where things were headed, and they wanted to intimidate. I don't think the soldiers who were manning this encampment really had a clue what. No one stopped me from taking pictures. Remember, this is 89, not 99. It was a very different situation. It wasn't tense, but it wasn't entirely relaxed. But the guns, the encampment, everything was pointed in the other direction, out towards Obilic, towards, not towards where the gathering was, but it was across the street. And no one tried to disrupt it. I, later that day, went with my interpreter, who was Laura Silver, who went on to become a well-known journalist in her own right, and who was stringing for the New York Times. Who was stringing for Voice of America and subsequently also for the Financial Times. We went to visit Ibrahim Rugova, whom I'd already interviewed once or twice. And one of these interviews had already been published in Drita, in Albania with my name, but identifying me only as Gazetar American, no mention of the Voice of America. And Rugova was very happy, surprised in fact that this interview had gotten such play not only in Albania but here. He didn't know until that point how many people were really listening, and people came up to him on the street constantly telling him, I heard your interview on Voice of America. So we went to, having visited him in his flat, we then, I guess in the spring, we then visited him in his office behind the stadium, where I interviewed him, and I sent that interview along with the audio from Gazimistan to the Voice of America in Washington. And what happened subsequently was a quarrel that turned physical in the newsroom at VOA between the head of the Yugoslav service, Veljko, I can't remember his last name, and the head of the Albanian service, where they almost came got into a fist fight where Veljko was refusing, not only refusing to broadcast the elements of the Rugova interview, but insisting that that interview not be broadcast by the Albanian service either, nor by the English language service. And it was settled by the news desk that this was Serbia's day, and that they weren't going to broadcast it that day, but they could do it the next day. Whether LSB Berai, the head of the Albanian service, then broadcast it in Albanian that day or had to wait, I don't recall. But tensions were high, even there.
Do you remember other personalities that whom you met at that time, or besides Rugova?
Recep Chosya was always away. He was always on the coast, on the Adriatic, never available. So the people that I spoke to, I spoke to a judge in the Martinovic case, which I'd been following on the pages of Jedinstvo. This was the famous case of the guy with the beer bottle who claimed that he'd been attacked by Albanians, and then it turned out it was self-inflicted in the middle of a field. And so I interviewed the judge in that case, but of course all he could say was, as long as the case is in progress, I can't comment on it. I sat in on various, or conducted interviews with officials from the Secretariat, I guess from the Secretariat for Information. In that sense, not impressive. I spoke to a garage mechanic here in Prishtinë who wanted to show me around and took me to Prizren and gave me two of the best quotes of the trip, and of the most memorable quotes I got from that era in Kosovo. One was, this was a guy who had 8 children. His wife was pregnant with the 9th, and he said that there's nothing more beautiful than an Albanian woman pregnant with her 9th child or 10th child or something. And that was a very different situation in those days. That was one of the quotes. The other quote was, when the revolution comes, we will unite with Albania, we'll fight and unite with Albania. And I said, hold on a second. Enver Hoxha has only been dead a few months. Or a year by then. He died in 84, 85, no, I can't remember. Anyway, he'd only been dead a few months. 85, April 85. Do you have any idea what uniting with Albania would mean, given the system that they have there compared to the relative freedom you have here? And his response was, we're Albanians, we can overcome all of that. we watch Albanian television, we see what a wonderful land it is. Yeah, well, they had bought into, or he had, among others. And this was also an interesting aspect. Then 10 years, more than 10 years later, 14 years later, in '99, interviewing Albanian refugees from Kosovars in Albania, and their shock at what they actually found. I mean, a number of people had already come to visit in the course of the '90s and were confronted with a reality that was very different from Albanian TV and radio. Yeah, so those are my my early visits. Sorry. And then other things began developing. The suppression of the Turkish community in Bulgaria turned into, the end of June, shortly after Vidovdan, or roughly at the same time, turned into, the suppression of the Turkish minority had been ongoing for years. However, on the 5th or 6th of June, Todor Zhivkov made an announcement in Sofia opening the borders, and I'd been very involved in covering that issue. So I went straight from Gazimestan to Belgrade, to Prishtinë, and then Belgrade, and flew to Istanbul and covered the outflow of that, of them. And then there was the the developments in the autumn in Budapest and Prague and Leipzig and so on. And so I covered the collapse of communism in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, and Poland, where I'd been for the elections where Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Polish Senate in mid-August. No, that was also June. It was the same weekend as Todor Zhivkov's speech. And finally, the focus shifted again to Yugoslavia in '91, as I recall, beginning of '91, or autumn '90, where there were incidents near the Plitvice Lakes in Croatia, where Serb vigilantes had cut down trees and were blocking roads and taking hostages of tourists and tourist buses and so on. And there was growing apprehension that something was going to happen in Croatia and or Slovenia. And in the end, a day apart, they declared independence from Belgrade, and VOA had a plan. At that point I was the Prague correspondent, there was a Vienna correspondent who went to Zagreb, I was in Belgrade. And I remember going in and out of Belgrade on a number of occasions in the summer and autumn of '91, being in Belin Manastir in Serb-occupied Croatian eastern Slavonia, which was under shell fire, no electricity, not a pleasant sight, visiting villages like Ilok, that had been abandoned by almost everyone except the clergy and the loonies. And then in '92, when on the May Day weekend, Sarajevo was being bombed by the Yugoslav Air Force, I took a walk on Kalemegdan because I couldn't get a radio signal in the Hotel Moskva on AM because of the structure or the jamming or whatever, not jamming, but interference. So I went to Kalemegdan because word had it among the reporters that you could get reception on your AM radio there, to listen to Radio Sarajevo and BBC, VOA, to find out what was actually going on. And I listened in real time to the pleas for help from Radio Sarajevo and watched people dancing spontaneously, relatively, at Kalemegdan, whether they were celebrating, whether they had any clue what was going on in Sarajevo, I don't know today. Or whether they had an inkling and were simply in a great mood, but you don't usually see dancing in the streets in broad daylight. And it wasn't a parade. A bunch of journalists, colleagues, went down to Sarajevo, and some never came back. They all went down in a convoy that weekend, and I chose not to go, because if there's one thing that I had learned as a correspondent over the previous years, your value is only as good as your ability to send a story out. And if you end up either behind bars or in hospital, you're cannon fodder at that point. And it's not as if I hadn't been to Sarajevo before, and it's not as if I hadn't already been reporting for months, for a year, that if the fighting in Croatia were to spread to Bosnia, it would be a completely different ball game, and then it would be a real bloodbath. So I knew, and I didn't go. And several people in that convoy met their ends within a matter of days, or ended up being medevaced with serious injuries. I subsequently did go to Bosnia on my own terms during the conflict on one occasion, and reported on it, and immediately was confronted with that irritation that so many reporters, not only at VOA, experience, where you're somewhere where the pack is not. And you have a report, but everyone else is reporting on something else. And your editors want you to report about that something else rather than on what you're experiencing. I'm sitting in a town that's encircled by the Serbs and is being shelled. And it was a multi-ethnic town even during the war. It was Serb, Croat, and this was Bihać, Serb, Croat, and Bosniak, Bosniak majority. And they said, yeah, but Sarajevo was being shelled. I said, yeah, but you've got a guy here. Yeah, but start with Sarajevo. But okay, that's an aside. So I covered, not on a day-to-day basis, but on an occasional basis over the next few years, I covered the Yugoslav conflict, the Bosnian conflict from Belgrade, the Croatian and Bosnian conflict also from on occasion from Zagreb. After Dayton, shortly after Dayton, I drove across Bosnia alone with my own car, which when I got back to Prague and my wife took it to the repair shop to be serviced, and they said, where in the name of hell have you been with this car? I'd driven through a few shell holes, potholes. Obviously it was not in great shape. But what I saw there, and I interviewed people along the way, driving from Bihać to Bijeljina across northern Serbia in the course of a week, picking up hitchhikers. So it was anonymous, relatively. These people were veterans from either side, some of them on crutches. They were refugees, Serbs from Sarajevo who had no intention of living in Sarajevo henceforth. I was in Brčko, which was among the most heavily shelled places I've ever visited. I mean, I would rank it with Vukovar. Bijeljina, where I interviewed the mayor and other town fathers who, you know, butter wouldn't melt in their mouths, and they gave the most innocent explanation of what happened to the Bosniak population there a couple of years earlier. That obviously didn't correspond at all with reality. During the conflict, whenever I did go to Belgrade, during that conflict in 92, 95, if I put Kosovo down on my Yugoslav visa application, I didn't get a visa. So I knew that simply was off limits for me, and I wasn't going to push it, because the regime by 95 was a very different regime than it had been in the 1980s. And then the Yugoslavs stopped giving me a visa entirely. In '99, I was in Turkey when the NATO bombing began. I was covering stories in southeastern Turkey near the Syrian border, and I eventually, later in April, managed to get a flight from Italy to Tirana, and I spent, I can't remember, 10 days, 2 weeks, covering the refugees all across Albania, from the tobacco factory in Shkodra to the stadium in Korça, to the military base in Malić, to a pasture on the west bank of Lake Ohrid, to the beach in Durrës, and the Drenica Cafe on the beach in Durrës, where they were recruiting fighters for the North Atlantic Brigade, or the Atlantic Brigade, or whatever, who had just arrived from the US and Canada off the boat from Italy, and so on. So I had a lot of interesting stories to report on, and there was a considerable uncertainty as to where this was all going to head, because Milosevic had not caved in. The bombing was going on day after day, week after week. The American military attack helicopters were parked on the tarmac at Tirana Airport and were not going to actually be utilized at any time in the near future. And the weather was generally overcast, rainy. Pilots weren't going under 15,000 feet, so most of the attacks were by missile rather than by low-flying aircraft here.
Were you working for Voice of America?
By then I was working for Radio Free Europe. I had started working for Radio Free Europe in '96. And I was based in the newsroom, so VOA had a much more hands-on attitude in putting reporters on the scene wherever. If you could get in there, the only rule was, beyond being objective, et cetera, was you don't go after the head of state and try to interview someone senior without permission, and you don't use excerpts of a national anthem. It either is the whole thing. Those are very simple rules to remember, and subject, verb, predicate, 13 lines to a minute, etc. Those were easy rules. Radio Free Europe was a little more complicated and a lot less fun. There was a lot less freedom, more restrictions, sitting in the newsroom the whole time. Just getting money for a single trip was a complicated process. They expected you to do all of your reporting over the telephone, and it was frustrating. But yeah, once after the Komanova military technical agreement was signed on the 9th of June, '99, then VOA started coming in, and always had someone here from the central newsroom, and very quickly established a Prishtinë bureau for the South Slavic service, of which the Kosovo unit was a part. And I came in then, it was my turn towards the end of August. And I made a beeline for Unic and saw that most of the kulas had been destroyed. I'd asked a colleague who had already been in Unic a couple of months before whether the kulas were still there, and his response was, "What's a kula?" Because Unic was known, obviously, for something other than just kulas. The fact was that it was a center of resistance, as it had been during the Cossack Rebellion in the early 1920s. But I went there and met with villagers who were generous despite the situation, their losses in lives and property in sharing their food and tales. I went to other villages where, in the Dukajin region, where all the men had been hauled off and slaughtered. I went to Dragash, where the Turkish K4 unit was in a frenzy to circumcise all the boys who hadn't had that opportunity under Milosevic, since circumcision had been discouraged at best. And so there were busloads of kids being brought down to Prizren in Turkish army buses, all dressed for their big celebration. They weren't all 5 years old either, but they started with young ones and worked their ways up. Anyway.
How much what you saw in Bosnia influenced your attitude toward Kosovo when you came here during the war?
Well, I didn't come here during the war, I came here after
the
the
war.
war. It's very different, and it didn't influence me that much. Those who in the military, in K4, I4, S4, who then subsequently came to UNMIK, who would say, oh, the difference between Bosnia and Kosovo is 4 years. Sorry. That is so far from reality, it's not funny. Yes, the aggressor may have been the same to a certain extent. However, that's where the historic parallels for me end. Historically, when you look at a map, and it's very clear what Bosnia represented for Ottoman Turkey. You look at the ethnic divisions in Bosnia. You look at how I4 and S4 then implemented a form of normalization in the Republika Srpska and in the Federation. A lot of that was missing here. Within 1 year of Dayton, everyone in Bosnia had standardized license plates. No one was driving around with Republika Srpska license plates. You still see KM plates for Mitrovica here, issued by Belgrade. Obviously not south of the Ibar, not being driven around south of the Ibar, and you'll see, PZ plates and for Prizren and UR for Uroševac, Veriza, etc., etc. There was no discussion. I mean, I4 and S4 implemented it. The job was the implementation. Serbia learned its lesson there. And although there were plenty of people who had worked in the High Commissioner's office and elsewhere who came down here, including at least one SRSG, getting Belgrade on board on license plates proved to be something that took more than a decade.
So you're saying that Serbia learned from Bosnia and
Serbia learned
its feet much more in Kosovo?
Yeah. Well, yes, but also because, that would be an oversimplification, because for Serbia to this day, Kosovo is Serbia. Hence, it's a different issue. With Bosnia, halfway through the conflict, it was clear that Belgrade was going to leave the Bosnian Serbs in the lurch, and they knew it. The Krajina Serbs in Bosnia were, and even more so in Serbia, were pretty much finished halfway through the war. They weren't certainly in the West. They were too far away, and when push came to shove, and it was clear, and then it happened during Operation Oluja, Belgrade abandoned them. Here, it took 11 weeks of NATO bombing, and it didn't have to last that long, but it did precisely because of a certain French officer in NATO who was passing on to Belgrade the targeting a day in advance or a few hours in advance. And so Milosevic knew he could hold on for so long, until the skies cleared and NATO bombed Serbian emplacements on the south slope of Mount Pastrik, along the main road coming in from Kuq, where the Serbs had been expecting later in the year a US-led NATO invasion, if it came to that. And so they had put a lot of material there, and men, and in one night, according to the Wall Street Journal, 500 Serbian soldiers and a lot of artillery were destroyed. And Milosevic, through Chernomyrdin, Russian premier, sued for peace very quickly after that. That's a very different end to what we saw with Oluya, which was US-backed, US-trained Croatian forces who finally, after 4 years of having their noses rubbed in the mud, were able to reclaim their territory, and they could have reached the gates of Belgrade if they hadn't been told to back off.